What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Mind Body Mushroom. Today, I'm really excited. We're diving into Gladio Part 2. We're really going to look at the architecture behind what Gladio was in a historical context and the implications for it in modern events and basically a lot of historical events between World War II and today. And I think it's super cool and important because once you kind of see the framework of Gladio, you will understand false flags and I don't know, just like a lot of the modern, counterinsurgencies, terrorism, a lot of these events, like words and giant concepts that have shaped the 20th century. A lot of them began in Gladio, like the end of World War II and into the Cold War. So also, as you can probably tell, if you're watching this on YouTube, we got a little bit different setup going on. I'm trying to figure out a few new things so I can maybe like sit a little more comfortably and we can get more of like a studio setup. So it's a little bit of a work in progress. As you can see, my wall is kind of blank. I got my surfboard on the floor. It's a work in progress, but I appreciate you guys tuning in and growing with me. Also, if you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Also on your Apple Podcasts, Spotify, we're on all the platforms. It really helps if you guys follow us, leave a review, subscribe, all those things. It really makes a difference. So, okay, cool. Before we get into this, I want to point out that this we're going to do a lot of, names and dates, and I will do my best to not get like super into the weeds of this because it's not so important. The historical, names and dates. It's about the framework. Okay. And it wasn't just a historical footnote, and it's not like some weird Cold War story. Like, this is a framework that once you recognize the pattern and see how fear and crisis and shock are used to manufacture consent, that was a little bit what we talked about in part 1. Okay, anyway, so what is Gladio? The word itself is actually it's a Latin word, like gladiator. It actually refers to the short sword that Roman, I guess, like legionnaires, I don't know what you go with, whatever you call Roman soldiers, that was a gladio. And so gladiators, right? Okay. But at its most basic level, Operation Gladio was a secret NATO-backed stay-behind network after World War II. So what exactly does that mean? Basically, okay, World War II, we have NATO, right? Or the Allies, rather. Then we have the Axis, which was, Japan, Germany, Italy, pretty much. And then we had the Soviet Union, which was part of the Allied forces, and they kind of were coming at Germany from the east, and NATO was hitting it from the west, right? So we defeat the Nazis, and my own perspective on this, and this is actually pretty widely covered, but really we defeated the Germans. The Nazis, many of which fled to Argentina, thanks to help from the Vatican. Others were poached via Operation Paperclip, which essentially brought a lot of the Nazi scientists and rocket scientists, doctors, a lot of the people that we thought we would get some value by having them on our team. We brought them over under this like secret program, and many of them changed their names and kind of got like fake background stories, so that because people would be like, what the fuck, you guys are just bringing Nazis over. So that was paperclip. But pretty soon after the end of World War II, the focus really became stopping the Soviets and communism from spreading westward. And that's why NATO was created. And, if you think about the Cold War, it was, we call it a Cold War, but there was a series of hot wars that actually happened. Korea being one of them, Vietnam, and then the Cold War with the Soviet Union. But a lot of this fear that communism was going to spread westward, and so that's why NATO created these stay-behind armies, which kind of operated in secret. So instead of just having like actual military forces on the border, what they did is they had plain clothes, kind of like they call them stay behind networks. So it's like, you've heard of like sleeper cells, right? Like the concept of a sleeper cell is like people that could be activated in an emergency to, repel some sort of invasion or whatever. Let's see. Okay, after World War II, communism wasn't just viewed as a military threat, it was also viewed as an economic threat. It threatened banks, it threatened multinational corporations, and the elite financial interests that had dominated Europe and the United States for decades. The fear wasn't just that Soviet tanks were going to, roll across the border. It was that voters would start voting the wrong way, right? Voting for these communist ideals. And if you've ever seen the movie Oppenheimer, there was a big, red scare after, Oppenheimer was one of the leading scientists that was working on the Manhattan Project, developed the nuclear weapons that we used in Japan. And if you've seen the movie, towards the end of it, he's starting to get interrogated, and people are questioning his communist ideations, and there was a lot of that going on. So that was the fears that people were going to start voting, for these communist principles. And this was actually, communist and socialist parties were gaining power democratically, especially in places like Italy, France, and Greece. So the fight against communism wasn't just ideological, it was also material. What Gladio represents is the moment when governments, intelligence agencies, financial elites, and private interests quietly aligned around a shared goal. Operation Gladio manufactured consent for the permanent exclusion of the political left from power in Western Europe, even when that exclusion contradicted democratic outcomes. So basically what they needed to do now was discredit these far left ideologies, right? And so on the surface, it all looked like a political struggle, right? Just democracy versus communism, East versus West, freedom versus tyranny. But underneath that was an intelligence layer. Intelligence agencies operating outside democratic oversight, justified by emergency, secrecy, and national security. For some of the historical stuff, I'm kind of jumping back and forth between notes and then kind of my own thoughts on these things. But let me just give me a second. Okay, here we go. Yep. So there's also connections to institutions like the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI. It's like this crazy, laundering bank. It was involved in so many crimes over the Iran-Contra era, just the entire Cold War. It was like the bank for intelligence agencies, organized crime lords, and just like everything off the books. Officially people wanted plausible deniability, that they would kind of route stuff through this BCCI. So it will come up in our story again. Some other really interesting things. If you've never heard of propaganda due, also known as P2, the P2 scandal was it was like a Masonic lodge in Italy, so Freemasonry, and had like fascistic connections. Okay, so part of the deal is clarifying some of these terms. So like fascism versus communism. We laymen kind of view them as like authoritarianism is just kind of the same. Like, communists are authoritarian, fascists are authoritarian. That's true. They are all authoritarian. That is like a better big bucket. But fascism and communism are very different in their actual ideologies. And so a lot of the fascists from World War II that, we didn't kill every fascist, or completely eradicate that ideology, off the face of the earth. There were still people in these countries that were fascist. And let's see. Let me see if I can get you a good definition of fascism, because it's important definition. Okay. Fascism is a far-right, authoritarian, and ultra-nationalist political ideology characterized by a dictatorial leader, centralized autocracy, militarism, and forcible suppression of opposition. Let's see. Fascism is far-right. Communism is far-left. In fascism, private property is controlled by the state and a dictator. Conversely, communism is a far-left ideology aiming for a classless, stateless society based on public ownership of production. Both are authoritarian, totalitarian systems requiring total subordination to the state. So there's, similar outcomes. It's just sort of like what direction you're coming from. So obviously, the fascists are going to have a problem with communism moving westward. So propaganda Dewey touches this, Iran-Contra touches this. This is all kind of in the same era, right? Let's see. And none of this actually began in the Cold War. If you trace these intelligence and financial relationships backward, they're the same names and the same structures. There's Wall Street law firms. There's multinational corporations, organized criminal enterprises, elite families, secret societies, banks with transnational reach and political influence. Just a couple that you may have heard of before and will come up again in this story are Brown Brothers Harriman, Sullivan and Cromwell, United Fruit Company. And a lot of those kind of run into the early architecture of the CIA itself. So prior to the CIA, there was what was called the Operation, or it's the OSS. What's the O stand for? Office. There you go. Office of Strategic Services. Okay, this was the precursor to the CIA, and the OSS was essentially like the intelligence apparatus during World War II. But where these initial OSS guys came from, these were people connected with elite institutions like Harvard and Yale, which also kind of tied into elite families, like the Dulles brothers and the Rockefellers, like a lot, all these kind of big American names, right? And that tied in. So we have, yeah. Lost my train of thought for a second, but essentially we had these elite institutions. They kind of had their, backdoor networks, these secret networks that were all connected with the elite. And the initial sort of concept of intelligence in the 20th century had a lot to do with private corporations and their intelligence gathering, and for like legal disputes, right? And so if you have never heard of the United Fruit Company's backstory, let me look this up. Kind of doing some research on the fly here. Appreciate you guys sticking with me. Yeah. So this was in the 50s too. All right. So this is right. This is literally in the same time frame that we're talking about. There was in Guatemala. Okay, there's a little bit of backstory. United Fruit Company later became Chiquita, as in like Chiquita bananas. They held massive power in Guatemala, controlling over 40% of the land and infrastructure. When President Arbonz in 1952, he did this land reform, what was called Decree 900, and it expropriated uncultivated United Fruit land. So they're essentially, the government was trying to, whatever is it called, when the essentially take back, land, nationalize. Thank you. That's the word, nationalize. The country was trying to nationalize the unused land back from United Fruit. And the company, so United Fruit, lobbied the U.S. government, and which was fearing communism, right? That was the whole thing, the Red Scare. So what they orchestrated was a CIA-backed coup to restore the fruit company's interests. So it just demonstrates, and it demonstrates how the private companies could leverage the state power, like the United States power, for their own interests. And that is basically, a lot of that was happening. This was happening in the 50s, but prior to this, like we were talking about, like the turn of the century, this is where a lot of these institutions and networks came from and were built. Let's see. So we like to tell ourselves that World War II ended fascism, but what actually happened was the Allies defeated the Axis power. Many Nazi scientists were absorbed through Operation Paperclip, and that laid the foundation for aerospace, intelligence research, military medicine, as well as programs like MK Ultra. I mentioned how the Vatican indirectly helped Nazis escape through rat lines run by clergy. They falsified documents, and they gave them shelter in Catholic networks in South America. Figures like Joseph Mengele lived out their lives abroad, in many in South America. And there were many influential Americans that openly sympathized with the Nazis and fascism before and during the war, some of which were Henry Ford, Charles Lindbergh, Ezra Pound. In fact, Hitler, even his obsession with eugenics was heavily influenced by the American eugenics programs, which were in California, and they were funded by elite foundations like the Rockefeller Foundation. So the fascist networks in World War II really just went underground and operated clandestinely rather than in the open like they did in Germany, Italy, and Spain. So what was Operation Gladio officially? Essentially, what it did was it operated in what became known as a strategy of tension. The tactics were to create fear, create chaos, so that the public demands order and control. Basically, they had what they would do is false flags. So the concept of a false flag is something that is meant to look like somebody else is doing it. It's actually a nautical term. What a pirate would do is they would put up, a British flag instead of like the Jolly Roger, and then people would think like, oh, it's the Brits, and then they would go and do, some crime, and people would think that the Brits did it, So that's the concept of a false flag. I'll give you a little definition real quick. Yeah, it's a flag flown to disguise the true identity or affiliation of a ship, or a political or military act orchestrated in such a way that it appears to have been carried out by a party that is not, in fact, responsible. So that's a false flag. It's pretty self-explanatory, but in case you weren't aware. So what was happening in Gladio is these stay-behind networks that were disguised as like civilians and not officially NATO armies. What they would do is pretend that they were these far left organizations, so that they were like communist and essentially just communist, but communist insurgents, and they would like bomb a fountain or a train bombing or a bank. In 1969 there was the Piazza Fontana bombing, and then 1980 there was a Bologna train station bombing. All of these were pinned on these far left groups, but it was actually NATO doing it through these Gladio networks. And this is all official. This is confirmed historic fact. In 1990, in fact, the Italian prime minister publicly confirmed the existence of Gladio. And then there were parliamentary investigations, and then NATO acknowledged similar networks across Europe. So Gladio specifically was the Italian one, but I mean, they had them in Norway, Spain, Germany, all over Western Europe. And the question is, did it stop? What happens when bombs become politically expensive? So, fear doesn't just disappear. These tactics don't just go away because, hey, we can't just go and bomb trains anymore. They just sort of evolve. They turn into psychological operations, disinformation campaigns, algorithmic amplification, blackmail rings. So a lot of the stuff that we see from, Michael Aquino, Colonel Michael Aquino, who was a U.S. Army colonel. He was also an open Satanist. He was the founder of the Church of Set, and was extremely instrumental in the psychological operations that were used during the Vietnam War. And they didn't just stop there, Anyway, Michael Aquino. Okay, Michael Aquino wrote this book called The Mind War, which was all about psychological operations. He was involved in some of the MK Ultra experiments, and was implicated in a number of scandals, like the Presidio preschool scandal. Also, his co-author, this is pretty interesting. Okay, his co-author, this guy named Michael Vallely, is a board member of Turning Point USA. So we will eventually get into the Charlie Kirk assassination because it's relevant to this framework of false flags and psychological operations meant to manufacture consent and sway sentiment in a certain direction for a political end. So literally, one of the guys that was like, a co-author of these psychological operations and how you sway public sentiment through false flags and war sits on the board of Turning Point USA. So when we see events like the National Guard shooting in DC, which is another one that's super, to me, it seems like the framework is there for, this is one of these false flag things. Also, the Bondi Beach shooting in Sydney, the Charlie Kirk assassination, many of these mass school shooters, we should be asking ourselves, why do they want us to believe, or who do they want us to believe did this? Who are they trying to pin this on? And who benefits from us believing the official narrative? Specifically, like the National Guard shooting, okay, this guy was an Afghan. He literally worked for the U.S. He was part of these, what they called zero units that were hit squads, basically. They were CIA-trained assassination squads that would just go around and do work for the CIA. They were taking out targets and whatnot, and this gave us kind of plausible deniability and whatnot. So we brought this guy back because these zero units were extremely vetted. In order to be working for these like super top secret CIA death squads, they were extremely screened and their backgrounds had been looked into. So they bring this guy back and then just randomly, snaps and kills 2 National Guard soldiers that probably shouldn't have been there in the first place because they had only been brought there, by the Trump administration as he was, cracking down on crime in the city. And even that, it was like he brought in National Guard because if you remember that guy, Big Balls, who was part of the Doge team, some like 19-year-old kid that was like, and don't get me started on the whole Doge scandal. That is ridiculous in its own right and was a total operation. But this guy, Big Balls, who everyone's familiar with because he was on the news, specifically because of his name, and it was sort of he gets like jumped, and because of that was sort of like, see, look how much crime there is in DC. So now we need to send in the National Guard. So now the National Guard's there, and then this Afghan CIA trained, assassin comes and gets the 2 National Guard members. I'm trying to be kind of careful about what I'm saying. I totally forgot that I'm like saying this on YouTube and stuff like that. The self-censoring is so frustrating. And just like the fact that you can't just speak, you actually have to be super aware of how you are speaking and the words you're saying. And, it's a bit frustrating, but I'm trying to be a little bit more conscientious of that. So just that example in itself, and I'll kind of go through some of these other ones, okay, so Big Balls, this polarizing figure on the right, gets jumped, by who knows who these two people are, but it's kind of weird. It's like right outside of the White House too. It's where he got jumped. So that alone seems a little fishy and kind of like a setup, which then compels this reaction of like, well, we need to send in the National Guard. Like, okay, now that's all in itself is sort of a polarizing, controversial thing. It's getting people upset. Are we creating a police state? Why are the military now patrolling the streets of Washington? And now look at that. Some random, immigrant gets radicalized, and he kills these two people. And then you look at his connection and you're like, oh, well, this dude worked for our government and was vetted, 10 ways from Sunday. How is that possible? The whole thing looks fake. Same thing with the Bondi Beach situation. And I'll be very careful with this because it touches a lot of subjects that get flagged. But essentially, this guy there were reports that he had worked for the IDF. I think that is actually true. Big, high level. Long story short, what's crazy is how hard it is to something about like when you're speaking on camera. If I was having this conversation with one of my friends or doing in person, like I would be so flawless in what I'm saying, the words I'm using, the expressions. Something about doing it on camera, it's like your brain just like goes blank. It's freaking crazy. It's one of the things I'm really trying to get better at. But I appreciate your guys' just like not forgiveness, just sticking with me through this process, because it's a bit of a learning process. But anyway, long story short, this guy goes to a super popular beach, very small beach, during the beginning of a Hanukkah celebration, and just kind of like indiscriminately starts taking people out. Also, firearms are extremely difficult to get in Australia. And yet this guy had one because he was part of these like, gun and hunting club things. So in a country where firearms are extremely locked down and you have to be very vetted to even be able to own one. Well, this guy does own one. He had been vetted. He'd been there for, I think like over a decade. And then just randomly decides that he's going to take out, in this, a bunch of people in this clearly anti-Semitic attack, right? Again, then it started coming out that like this guy may have worked for the IDF at some point. And the reasoning for this attack is what we were told, the public, was because Australia had been sympathizing with the Palestinians, and they had acknowledged a Palestinian state. And you would think that then that would mean that like radical Muslims would leave Australia alone because they're a Western country that is, doing ostensibly what you think they would want them to do. But in this case, for whatever reason, logic goes out the window, and he starts, unaliving all of these people, specifically because Australia supports Palestine. And what happens immediately after this? He gets the prime minister gets condemned by Netanyahu, and the prime minister of Australia is condemned by Netanyahu. They say that they're going to crack down even harder on firearm ownership, and they're going to start restricting speech online even more, because clearly, there's so much anti-Semitism, happening. So again, the logic of it internally doesn't even fully make sense. Also, where were the police? There was a police station literally across the street, basically, from where this event happened at Bondi Beach. Bondi Beach is not very big. It's maybe a half mile distance, and if you look on a map, there is a police station right there. The police didn't show up for over 20 minutes. What? I think it may have been even more than that, more than 20 minutes. But still, regardless, I mean, that it's like an absurd amount of time for something like this to be happening without any sort of intervention. We're going to do an entire episode on the Charlie Kirk because that is super interesting. And the longer this kind of goes, the more information comes out. It just gets wild. So that deserves its own thing. So if Gladio was the military layer of the system, then the next logical question is obvious. Who coordinated the political layer? Who shaped the courts, the media, the financial systems, and the narrative environment that civilians actually live inside? And so this is where the P2 enters. So remember, the Propaganda Due, what's commonly known as P2, was a Masonic lodge in Italy. Investigators discovered that P2's membership overlapped nearly every institution that mattered in the modern state. They had military leadership, intelligence services, judiciary, media executives, banking and finance, as well as connections to the Vatican. But P2 wasn't a government, and it didn't pass laws, didn't run elections. It was a network that sat across governments. And this is what people refer to as a deep state. It's a permanent government, a supranational organization that spans different aspects of government, internally, if you're talking about just within one state, but also internationally, right? These networks also cross borders. Okay. P2 functioned as a coordination layer, a place where people embedded in different institutions could align strategy, share information, and shape outcomes without leaving fingerprints. And we know this because P2 was exposed through documents. One of the most important was something called the Plan for Democratic Rebirth. Plan for Democratic Rebirth was a document that proposed weakening Parliament, centralizing executive power, restructuring the judiciary, controlling major media outlets, neutralizing political opposition through narrative control and legal pressure. Let me just pause. I'm still talking about 1980s Italy. I was not talking about the United States. Does that sound familiar, though? I'll say those again. Weakening Parliament, which in our context would be Congress, just make Congress completely useless. Centralize executive power. That's exactly what's happening. I mean, you have the Department of Justice, the Attorney General, the FBI, all of these people that are supposed to be a secondary branch of power. They're all now sort of Trump's lackeys, and they're all part of expanding executive power, appointing judges that are going to be loyal to the executive's interests instead of a check and balance on his power. That's what's happening in the U.S., and that essentially what was happening during the P2 scandal. So it wasn't about overthrowing democracy overnight. It was about reshaping it slowly from the inside while preserving the appearance of normal governance. And P2 shows us that power doesn't always operate through coups and tanks. Sometimes it operates through appointments, through media ownership, judicial influence, financial leverage, and political blackmail. Who's the big blackmailer that 6 million documents? We have 3 million documents now. There's 6 million total, probably even more. But Yeah, and when you place P2 next to Gladio, something becomes very clear that Gladio created fear in the streets. Gladio was sort of the militaristic arm of this, and P2 managed fear in institutions. They shaped the narrative. This is the Michael Aquino mind war aspect of it, the disinformation. Gladio destabilized the public space, and P2 stabilized elite consensus. So once you understand Gladio as the military layer and P2 as the political coordination layer, the next question is, how did all this function in the real world? And that's where the financial layer comes in. This is the part that makes everything else possible. How are you going to fund all of this? The story leads directly to institutions like the Banco Ambrosiano and the Vatican Bank. Banco Ambrosiano wasn't just a commercial bank. It sat at the intersection of offshore shell companies, political institutions, intelligence interests, secret societies, and organized crime, just like BCCI, right? Now, money was routed through a web of offshore entities designed to do three things: hide the origin, hide the destination, and fragment responsibility. The Vatican Bank provided a layer of moral and institutional insulation. You can trust them, right? It's the Vatican. It's a bunch of good Catholics. What could go wrong? Offshore shell companies provided legal insulation, political connections, and blackmail networks provided protection. And when Banco Ambrosiano collapsed under the weight of massive financial irregularities, its chairman, Robert Calvi, was found dead under suspicious circumstances. He was hanged beneath the Blackfriars Bridge in London. So again, it's like these mysterious deaths and people in positions of power that know too much and outlive their usefulness. His death was ruled a suicide. It was widely disputed, and it was never fully resolved. Financial secrecy made political secrecy possible, and political secrecy made military secrecy sustainable. Without money that can disappear, networks like Gladio and P2 cannot survive. And who else benefits from the mysterious origin of money and money laundering and offshore shell companies and banks? Organized crime. And in the context of Italy, you have the mafia, right? But organized crime networks exist in every country, and these are transnational organizations, but they have the same. This is why there's such a close connection between organized crime and intelligence agencies. It's having off books finances, obfuscating where money is coming from and mixing it kind of in with legal corporations and services. Yeah, so that's where it all kind of starts becoming this big melting pot of multinational corporations, organized crime, and intelligence agencies. So now let's talk a little bit about BCCI to Iran-Contra to Epstein, because it connects here as well. BCCI, also known as the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, wasn't just a corrupt bank. It functioned as a financial utility for covert power. It operated across dozens of countries, used shell companies layered inside shell companies, and specialized in moving money in ways that were deliberately opaque. BCCI sat exactly where intelligence agencies, arms dealers, organized crime, and political intermediaries needed a bank to sit. So Iran-Contra, this happened during the 80s. It's a very complicated scandal. There's a lot of moving parts in the Iran-Contra, but big picture, essentially what was happening is we had placed an arms embargo on Iran. So saying we cannot sell them weapons because we were kind of backing Iraq in the Iran-Iraq war. But we were still selling them. We actually were still selling them to Iran, but through Israel as an intermediary. In exchange for selling them weapons, we were also using that money to fund the Contras, which were like South American armies they were like insurgencies, basically. So in South America, there was a lot of communism, socialism that was happening. And so what we would do is we would fund the opposition, which one man's terrorist is another man's counterinsurgency. There's insurgent. One man's terrorist is another man's insurgent. So it really just it depends on the perspective that you're sitting on. But so we were funding these insurgents to overthrow the socialist governments, and we were doing this all with this money that was off the books. And then we would take cocaine from South America and sell it we would traffic it into the United States. The CIA was doing this, and we would get it onto the streets, specifically in inner city neighborhoods like South Central Los Angeles. That was the whole story with Freeway Ricky Ross. He was moving tons of cocaine in to South Central, and that's what kind of like fueled the crack epidemic. And the journalist, this guy named Gary Webb, started investigating this around the time it was happening, and he mysteriously, I can't remember if they ruled his death as suicide or something, but it was one of these things where he was obviously murdered, but it was done by probably the state or an intelligence agency, so the guy was like suicided. Now, when Iran-Contra comes into view, it doesn't require a chase or a city. It requires a BCCI. Okay, so BCCI becomes like the central banking hub of the Iran-Contra affair, which, I kind of did a poor job just there explaining a couple of the moving pieces, but there were so many different components to Iran-Contra. But it's an operation that moves weapons covertly, launders proceeds through offshore structures, funds proxy forces, and bypasses Congress, courts, and public oversight. It showed that drugs and armed trafficking, money laundering, intelligence coordination, blackmail, and political deniability could be integrated into a single system that crossed borders and survived exposure. Crucially, it showed that no single node of this network mattered. People were expendable, but the system itself was not. Now, Iran-Contra had a cast of colorful characters like Adnan Khashoggi, who was the main arms trafficker between Israel and Iran. He was a Saudi, and he was also one of Epstein's clients. So this is what really ties Epstein into the Iran-Contra network. We tend to view the Epstein saga as like the early aughts, early 2000s through 2019. Maybe we'll go back and when tie him to Trump in the 90s. But if you really look at his whole background and history, the guy, is right at in the heart of the Iran-Contra affair. And his whole backstory, this was a little bit of a side note, but it's kind of interesting. he gets his first, like real job working as a math teacher at what's called the Dalton School in New York. Dalton School is a very elite private school. Epstein didn't even have a college degree, but he gets hired, and the headmaster of this school is Donald Barr, who was former Attorney General Bill Barr's father. Donald Barr was also an OSS guy. So you have this old intelligence, spook, basically, and, part-time novelist who was like a science fiction writer, and he writes this like disgusting, perverted novel about like intergalactic child trafficking and like sex slavery. Like that's what it's I can look it up, but Space Relations, that was the name of his book. But anyway, so he's a weird character. Anyway, he hires Epstein then goes from there to Bear Stearns. Bear Stearns, he's involved in a ton of these financial scandals, like the Towers financial, like a Ponzi scheme, basically. This guy named Pottinger, who I think was involved, Douglas Lease was an arms trafficker. He was also an associate of Epstein. Like I said, Adnan Khashoggi was part of this Epstein network, or he was Epstein's client, and he was like the main guy that was moving arms between Israel and Iran. So his whole background is Iran-Contra. Khashoggi wasn't just an arms dealer. He was a financial and logistical intermediary, the kind of person who moves comfortably between intelligence services, governments, weapon manufacturers, and offshore finance. Also, Adnan Khashoggi's cousin was Jamal Khashoggi, the guy who MBS had murdered in a Saudi embassy in Turkey, right? So, and his whole thing's like, these people aren't just one-offs. Like, they're all part of this network. And so understanding the connections and the relations between these people helps get a clearer picture. Because even something like that, it's just like, oh, well, a Washington Post journalist, murdered for no good reason by MBS. Oh, because he was critical of, MBS. Like, come on, there's always more there. A lot of people are critical of what MBS or Saudi Arabia is doing in general, and MBS is actually pretty liberal compared to the Wahhabists who are on the other side of the House of Saud. And so MBS is really a reformer. I'm not here to argue on behalf of MBS. I'm just saying, the reasoning that we got for Jamal Khashoggi's execution is a very paper thin justification. Doesn't really make sense. Okay, now let's look at Robert Maxwell. Maxwell sits at another critical junction of media power, offshore finance, intelligence relationships, and he too had a sudden death under unresolved circumstances. Fell off his boat. Many people believe he was trying to blackmail the Mossad and got a little too big for his britches. And but anyway, good news was he had a state funeral and is buried on the Mount of Olives. His funeral is also attended by numerous high-ranking Mossad assets. So maybe he had something to do with intelligence agencies. Also, one of my favorite scandals is the Promise software scandal. I highly recommend people watch the Octopus Conspiracy on Netflix. It was like a couple parts, 5-6 part documentary about this Promise software scandal. I think there's actually some really good podcast series about it that go into a little bit more detail. But if you're interested in this kind of Cold War intelligence crime syndicate world, highly recommend looking into the Promise software scandal, also known as the Inslaw affair. But Promise was not just software, it was surveillance and intelligence integration tool, a way to map financial transactions, intelligence files, and law enforcement data across systems. Now, if you look at this is like an aside, but Promise is, it's a pretty rudimentary concept now. It's basically just like database querying and management, but at the time it was very revolutionary, and it has sort of evolved through the ages. Then there was Pegasus, which is still being used to this day. Actually, I think now they might be using something beyond Pegasus, but Pegasus was doing the same thing. Palantir is doing the same thing. And it kind of illustrates how, when we think of like weapons trafficking, arms trafficking, we're not just talking about, AK-47s and, Tomahawk missiles or something like that. Like, we're also talking about technology, and how sometimes these technologies are hacked and they create backdoors that allow for espionage. And so it's super interesting to me. But Promise was a way to map, so Maxwell's proximity to Promise and Promise's alleged circulation among intelligence services, including Israel, tells you something important about this ecosystem: that information is power, data is leverage, and financial data is the crown jewel. Another way that they were using this Promise software is they would, sell it to a country, even allies. Like, we sell it to France, right? And then, but there's this backdoor installed so that we can monitor, what are they searching for? How are they using it? It's actually a similar thing just kind of happened with the Epstein file release. So they gave congressmen that they could go and look at the unredacted files, but they only had like 4 computers and they had a limited amount of time, and it was like a whole thing. But what they found out is they didn't just like give them the computers and like, okay, go ahead, do what you want to do, like search whatever you want. What they were monitoring was, what were they searching for? What were the keystrokes? What were the search terms? Because that tells you, okay, this is the direction that the people investigating this are going. Knowing what they're looking for helps you kind of understand, like, oh, what do I need to hide? Where do we need to sort of protect ourselves? And that same logic underpins blackmail, compromat, and elite control. All right, so I told you about Epstein. Another kind of interesting connection between Iran-Contra, Epstein, and the CIA was during the Iran-Contra affair, there was this airline called Southern Air Transport. And if you ever saw that movie American Made, it was with Tom Cruise. He plays this guy named Barry Seal, who was a pilot, and he was essentially trafficking cocaine from Colombia into the United States. And he was doing this via Southern Air Transport, which was a CIA-linked airline. And that's why he was getting away with it. If you remember kind of the in the movie, the FBI like catches him, and they're like, we're gonna throw you away forever, and he's like no, you're not. And ultimately he gets let go. And the reason why is because he was doing this on behalf of the CIA. Also, he was sending, where Southern Air Transport was landing in the United States was in Arkansas, when Bill Clinton was the governor of Arkansas. So now Southern Air Transport gets utilized by Leslie Wexner, who is kind of Epstein's patron, during, for Limited 2, like for his the Limited brand, right? That was his whole deal. So it kind of, now the CIA airline that was used for trafficking cocaine into Bill Clinton's state gets moved to Ohio, and now it's being used for bringing in merchandise to this guy, Leslie Wexner, who's part of what's called the Mega Group, which is a whole other rabbit hole. But like, okay, come on. Clearly, there's an intelligence operation happening here. Okay. So let's bring this back to the thesis that we laid out in the first episode. This is a series about systems and how they operate covertly towards certain aims. Because once you understand systems, you stop getting trapped in speculation and you start asking better questions. The simplest one being, who benefits? Cui bono, right? So when you're looking at something, like the Charlie Kirk assassination, instead of asking like, who pulled the trigger, or who made the phone call, let's look at who benefits from the outcome of this. Extremism, so like an event occurs, the Charlie Kirk thing occurs, and the outcome is remarkably consistent. Extremism rhetoric expands, surveillance powers are justified or accelerated, enforcement becomes asymmetric, tech-based solutions are pitched immediately, and internal power shifts quietly inside institutions. Purpose, there's this saying, it's a good saying to kind of internalize, but it's that the purpose of a system is what it does. Okay? The purpose of a system is what it does. As in, not what it says it's going to do, not what it's supposed to do, it's what it actually does. Not what it claims to do, it's what it reliably produces. So if a system repeatedly produces fear, polarization, expands surveillance, and concentrated authority, then that is its function. Intent becomes secondary. So this is why we've spent so much time on history to recognize structural similarity. We have Operation Gladio, which we mentioned, the Moscow apartment bombings, which this is an acknowledged false flag event that happened in Russia, and it's kind of what put Putin in power. The USS Liberty, which was kind of it's not really a false flag, but it's like one of these things where, we were attacked by our ally, Israel, and it was just sort of chalked up as a mistake. But it got us radicalized and motivated, for the war at the time. Let's see. Yeah, the aftermath. Okay, so yeah. It was a Navy technical research ship attacked by Israeli forces on June 8, 1967, during the Six-Day War in international waters off the Sinai Peninsula. The assault by aircraft and torpedo boats killed 34 crew members and wounded over 170 others. Yeah, so it's a very controversial, interesting event that we'll maybe cover in a later episode. Also, September 11th, what happened as a result of September 11th, right? The Patriot Act. We have 2 wars in the Middle East, the expansion of the surveillance state. All of this happened, right? And who benefits from that? These events are not identical. They don't share perpetrators, but they don't share context, but they do share architecture. confusion in the early reporting, contradictions in the official narratives, immediate political utility, expanded state power following public shock, and the narrowing of acceptable questions. And that brings us to what comes next. In the next episode, we're going to take this framework and apply it to a modern event, specifically the Charlie Kirk assassination. What narratives emerged immediately, what policies were justified, and what power dynamics shifted, and who benefits from the outcome. Because once you stop asking who did it and start asking what did it do, Gladio stops becoming a Cold War story and it becomes a living framework. And once you recognize that framework, you start seeing it everywhere. So that's it for today. Thank you guys for making it this far in the episode. We're trying out a few different formats. I think this one actually works pretty well. A little bit of outline and prepared remarks, but then also just me kind of going off the top of my head. The searching online, I'm kind of 50-50 on that. I don't like that it stops the flow of what we're doing, but I do like that instead of misquoting something or getting something wrong, or struggling as I'm trying to form a sentence, I do like that I can just maybe go and research for 2 seconds. So if you guys don't mind, the pauses and just kind of bearing with me as I'm looking something up, I might keep them in what we're doing. I just want to give a shout out really quick. I should have done this earlier, to our sponsor, Wind & Sea Coffee, the world's best tasting adaptogen infused coffee products. We do whole bean infused coffee, and you can choose how you infuse if you want calming adaptogens like CBD or functional mushrooms. We also do matcha with lion's mane and some functional latte powders like a chai latte mix with reishi mushroom and a loca mocha, which is kind of a 10 mushroom blend. It's really great to add to your coffee, add to your smoothies. Delicious. That's kind of where we're coming at it from, is I've tried a lot of other mushroom coffee products and they taste like shit. Ours do not. They're delicious. They're meant to be delicious, and they are really good for you. So check us out, windandseacoffee.com. If you want to support the show, support Wind & Sea Coffee, because it's my baby. It's my little baby, and I love it. And I need to take care of it and feed it money. So, all right, guys, that's it. See you next time. Peace.